At the end of the last video, I said something would break. This is where that happened. Not eventually, not hypothetically, it already had. Before I go any further, I need to be clear about two things. First, what you're hearing and seeing isn't my actual voice or footage. It's an AI generated version of both. I'm using this because my condition makes it difficult to reliably record and present something of this length and consistency. So this is the most accurate and sustainable way for me to communicate all of this properly. Second, this isn't a complaint. I'm not doing this to vent or to blame individuals. I'm showing you what happens, using my situation as a case study, because this isn't unique to me. The details are specific, but the structure isn't. This is what happens when a system doesn't stabilize properly. After everything that had already happened, the assessments, the delays, the meeting, the follow-ups, my situation didn't stabilize. It continued to deteriorate. Not because something dramatic changed overnight, but because nothing changed at all. And with a progressive condition, that matters. There's only so long you can compensate. Only so long you can absorb the gaps yourself. Eventually, your body stops cooperating with that. Day to day, things were already difficult. Getting food, moving safely, keeping clean. There were still days where I couldn't prepare meals, days where I fell and had no one to help me up. That wasn't new, but it was becoming less manageable. Around this time, I started to feel unwell. At first, it didn't stand out. Fatigue was already part of daily life. Pain wasn't unusual, so there wasn't a clear point where it felt different. But it didn't pass. It got worse. Eventually, it reached a point where I couldn't get out of bed. The pain was too much. I couldn't move properly. I couldn't manage anything on my own. And there was no one coming in to check on me. No one to notice that something had changed. If there had been regular care in place, this likely would have been identified earlier. Someone would have seen the difference. They would have acted. But there was no one there, so from bed I had to call an ambulance myself. And then wait, not knowing how long it would take or what would happen. When paramedics arrived, they assessed me where I was. From their perspective, there was no obvious indication of what was happening internally, and I wasn't able to explain it properly. By that stage, my baseline level of pain and exhaustion was already high. I had been dealing with ongoing difficulty for a long time, so this didn't stand out in the way it should have. I couldn't clearly convey the severity of what was happening, and there was no one else there to do that for me. If a carer had been present, they would likely have recognized the change. They could have explained it. They could have pushed for escalation. But I was alone, so the situation wasn't acted on at that point, and in that gap, the condition continued to develop. What had started as appendicitis became more serious. By the time I was admitted to hospital, my appendix had burst, which meant a more complicated operation, a longer recovery, and significantly more strain on my body, especially with an underlying condition. This wasn't a sudden, unpredictable event. There were multiple points where earlier intervention could have changed the outcome. If there had been adequate care in place, the deterioration would have been noticed earlier. If there had been a response to the ongoing situation, it may not have reached this stage. I had made complaints. I had sent follow-ups. The formal complaint had already submitted covered the issues going back to the beginning of the case. But the level of support did not change. And this is what delayed systems look like in practice. They don't respond when problems begin. They respond when those problems become unavoidable. By that stage, the situation is more serious, more difficult to manage, and more resource intensive to resolve. Earlier intervention would have reduced risk. It would likely have prevented escalation. Instead, the response came later, after the situation had already developed into something more severe. And by the time I was in hospital, the situation hadn't been resolved. It had just moved location. Because being in hospital didn't resolve the situation, it exposed it. The immediate medical issue was treated, surgery was carried out, but discharge wasn't possible. Not because I wasn't medically stable, but because there was no care in place for me to return to. I couldn't go back to my flat. Not safely, not realistically. There was no support structure there. So I stayed, not by choice, but because there was no alternative. This was in July 2025, and what followed wasn't a short delay. I remained in hospital for 74 nights, over 2 months, partly due to recovery, but also because there was nowhere appropriate for me to be discharged to. The hospital was effectively holding me, while another part of the system tried to organize something that should already have been in place. And during that time, the situation became clearer. Not just in terms of what had happened physically, but what the system was actually doing. A hospital bed costs around £500 per night. Across 74 nights, that comes to £37,000. That's before you even include surgery, ongoing treatment, staff time, or additional complications. And none of that needed to happen in that way, because the original issue wasn't sudden illness. It was the absence of adequate care. The council had been trying to manage costs by delaying or limiting care provision, but in doing that, the problem didn't go away. It escalated, and when it escalated, it transferred into a different part of the system, the NHS, which then carried a much higher cost. So instead of a controlled, planned, relatively low-cost care package, the result was an emergency admission, a more complex surgery, and a prolonged hospital stay, all funded from the same overall public budget. This is what short-term decision-making looks like in practice. Each part of the system trying to manage its own pressures, but without coordination, without continuity, and without accountability for what happens when those decisions interact. The result isn't efficiency, it's displacement and escalation. And while that was happening structurally, there was also the personal side of it. Because being in that environment for that length of time, in that condition, without clarity about what would happen next, has an impact. Physically, recovery was already slow. That was expected, but mentally it was something else. For a long time I had been managing, pushing through, trying to stay independent, trying to keep things functioning, even when they weren't properly supported. But this was different, because now everything had stopped, and I could see the full scale of what hadn't been addressed. Not just the immediate situation, but the pattern, the length of time it had been going on, the lack of resolution, and the reality that even after all of this, nothing was actually in place. There was no clear path forward, no stable support, no indication that things would suddenly start working. Just the same system at a later stage, and at that point, mentally something gave way. I attempted to take my own life, not impulsively, but as a result of prolonged pressure, exhaustion, and the absence of any viable way forward that I could see at the time. And that sits alongside everything else in this situation, not separate from it, part of it, because this isn't just about physical care. It's about what happens when someone is left in a system that doesn't resolve. Over time, that has consequences, and even after that point, the situation still wasn't resolved. The only reason I was eventually able to leave the hospital was because a temporary emergency care arrangement was put in place. Not a full solution, not a stable package, just enough to allow discharge, which meant that even at that stage, after everything that had already happened. The underlying issues still hadn't actually been fixed.